Good morning, everybody. At least it is still out here in California. I'm very much appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak to the Kansas City League about IT governance. Today we're going to be really thinking about and talking about IT governance as kind of a holistic view of what goes into governance. Governance is about enabling an organization to manage specific types of challenges that we're all facing. And so we're going to talk about those challenges first. These are the driving needs, why organizations begin looking at IT governance. Then we're going to talk about what is IT governance and look at the role of risk management as it relates to IT governance. So one of the first challenges that we face in IT organizations today is really keeping IT up and running. You know, our business today, it doesn't matter if you're in healthcare or higher education or financial management systems, doesn't matter what we do. Today, everything is running on IT services. It used to be like if you went to your doctor's office years ago, you know, you'd have your folder on the outside of the door. I can't remember the last time that I've been to a physician's office where I've seen a physical piece of paper that holds information about, you know, my medical history. And if that system that holds that data goes down, then we immediately see that the organization, the physicians can't, you know, everything kind of slows down. They're not sure. They have to ask the patient a lot more questions as they're doing their diagnostics. It just enables what we do within, you know, our industries to be so much more efficient. And so when those services go down, you can immediately see this impact on the business. It can be loss of business, loss of profits. It can also result in damage to reputation of the organization. I mean, I can remember recently when Amazon went down. It made it, you know, to the press. We grow dependent upon these IT services. And so when we look at the way that we've built services, there are often many layers of complexity in the environment, and keeping these systems up and running is a very difficult thing for us to do. I mean, we're expected to have the services up and running with very limited downtime. Another challenge is to deliver value, and there's been a lot within the ITIL framework that especially in the newest release, to talk about what is value and how do we create value. Ultimately, the services that we provide have to enable those business processes. If the processes are clumsy, if the technology doesn't really do what they want it to do, it slows down the performance of the business. And really, when we begin thinking about, well, how do we design services that are better fit for the business process, it requires us to build these strategic relationships with the business where we're really understanding what are the requirements, what is the amount of effort that it's going to take us to deliver that system. This ability for us to define requirements and engage on those requirements and then deliver those requirements is what value is all about. But yet we have projects that run over the time that we've allotted. We did a very poor job of estimating how many resources and the funding that we were going to need. And ultimately, if the service, even if it goes over and it costs more but doesn't deliver what they expected, we miss that value proposition for the business. So it's very important that we enable us to be able to execute our strategy and deliver the expected value within the time frame and budget that we've planned for. If you look at the 5 functions that I have there, the service desk, admin, HR, client services, network operations, these are the functional areas within either the business or our IT organization that have to work together to deliver that value. And so when we begin looking at a framework such as ITIL and begin developing processes, our goal is to connect across those functional silos. So for incident management, request, event, problem, change, release, service level, config, all this does is it creates this connectivity across those functional silos where we're really working to define an outcome that will deliver value, and we're working more efficiently together. But if you look at all the inputs and outputs, those are the lines that are going in the same direction as the functional silos. we begin to see that this what we're building is truly a value network. All of these inputs and outputs all connect us together across those functional silos. So if we make a change in any one area, say someone makes a change in the way that we staff the service desk, it's kind of like a spider web. We're kind of tugging at the end of that spider web and taking our chances that we're not going to put a big hole in the middle of that spider web. So when we think about how difficult it is to create value, it's because of the complexity of what it takes to create a value network. Defining all of this, working together, sharing these inputs and outputs are all very much part of creating that value network. Now, when we look at what we're doing from a service perspective, we have our service from the end user through the WAN to the server, back out through the WAN into our database. And we look at the way that these processes kind of map across those functional silos. You know, the service desk is focusing on restoring service, and the desktop team is managing the desktop system, and they're involved in incident and problem management. When we look at all these functional silos and all of the processes that we begin to adopt, we have to be able to understand that ultimately the value is created through the service, and that everything that we're doing within those functional silos and the processes that we're creating are meant for us to deliver that service in a way that will be valuable to the business. Now, one of the things that enables us to also create value is to begin to put something in place that helps us to manage all of our services throughout the life cycle. The service portfolio is that database or mechanism that allows us to track what we're doing as a service provider. So if the business comes to us and begins to put a lot of pressure, we need to implement this new service, we can draw visibility into everything that we're working on in the pipeline, all the things that we've delivered that we're managing and supporting in the live environment, and then, of course, tracking the things that we might retire so that if there is a new need that we can leverage a retired service, we have access to that. So when we think about defining value and delivering on that value, we need this mechanism that shows the business exactly what everything that we're working on, and it shows where we're allocating our resources across that list of services so that we can define the value proposition. It creates a lot greater transparency into what that value is. Our next challenge is cost, and I think this has been something in the last 3 years since we've had this economic downturn that has been really something that's impacted organizations a lot, which we have to really contain the way that we spend and apply money within IT services. So, first of all, it requires us to have a really good understanding of where we're spending our money so that when we get into these cost-sensitive times, we can make adjustments in the expenditure where it makes sense to. A lot of times we just come in and say, okay, cut headcount. Well, cutting headcount can have a tremendous impact on the value proposition. It can have a tremendous impact on keeping services running. So we need to better understand where we're spending our money, what the true cost of services are, so that when we do have to reduce expenditures, we have a much better, clear indication of where we can cut those costs without impacting some of the other things that we're challenged with, which is, the value proposition. Another challenge is complexity. Now, here's one I think that we've created our own headache here. There is a lot of complexity in the way that we've created our IT systems, and a lot of it comes from the way that IT organizations have kind of evolved over time. We didn't spend a lot of time up front putting standards in place and defining the way that we as an organization would minimize this complexity. We kind of were given unlimited budgets back in the 1980s, and we just kind of went out and adopted all this different technology, and then we're having a difficulty managing that level of complexity that we now see in the environments. Multiple platforms, multiple versions of software within the environment, no standards on desktops, and it becomes very difficult for us to manage that complexity, and it actually impacts cost. It impacts being able to keep services up and running. And ultimately, it's definitely going to impact value if we can't manage that complexity. So as an organization, when we don't do well when managing complexity, it definitely impacts, providing IT services becomes much more expensive for the organization. Now, for many of us, the industry that you're in will probably have a lot of laws and regulations that are impacting it. So if you're in healthcare, it's, HIPAA. If you are doing financial transactions online, we now have all the PCI regulations that we have to comply with. If you're in financial management, it's Basel II. If you're publicly traded, it was Sarbanes-Oxley a couple years ago. And now, Homeland Security has driven a lot of laws and regulations on state and local governments. So this is probably one of the biggest drivers that organizations begin to go after IT governance, because if you think compliance, you think governance. But governance is really about more than just complying to the laws and regulations that, are kind of impacting your particular industry. But when the business comes to us and says we have HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley or PCI, right, we have to, as an IT organization, understand how can we enable the business to comply with these laws and regulations, because HIPAA is about patient data. PCI is about financial credit card information of our customers. What we have to do is be able to enable the security of that information on our systems, making certain that we can maintain privacy, and being able to go back to these regulatory groups and say, yes, we are compliant with this law or regulation. So we have to initiate a lot of control within the IT environment to ensure that that happens. Of course, security goes hand in hand with that, right? The secure access to our services, to the data, maintaining confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data are primary motivators for many of what we put in policy in many organizations today is to help regulate security, whether it's the physical security of our IT environments or the logical security of the systems that we have available. So this is another really driving force for many organizations to control the risk around security with defined methods and policy so that we can minimize our exposure to these risks as it relates to IT services. Now, when we think about risk, there are many, in addition to security, there's a variety of different risks that we have to manage. There's our risks, within the service provider realm itself. If we're going to have a contract with a third party, there's all the risks associated with establishing an appropriate contract, but then managing that contract to deliver value and to minimize costs within the environment. Then we have the design risk. The business comes to us with this great new opportunity. How do we manage the risk around designing a new product or service that will meet the needs of the business and minimize our exposure to risk? There are the risks of the operational environment. What do we do when we're delivering and supporting those services on a day-to-day basis? How do we minimize the risks around that? And then looking outside of the service provider realm, there are also the market risks to the business themselves. They want to go out and they want to be agile and be able to compete in a market space, be an innovator, keep up with their competitors. There's all kinds of risks within that market space. So when we think about risk is so much more than making certain that someone has a password that's protected. It crosses everything when we talk about that value network, from our business process and our business all the way through to IT staff and the activities that they're performing. Another challenge here is aligning IT with the business, and this has been a major focus of the ITIL framework since the release of the 2007 edition of the books. What we need to do is become that strategic advisor with the business, and this isn't easy to kind of bridge from we're kind of growing IT up in the garage to now we want a seat at the big dining table with all the adults, right? I mean, we kind of had to evolve the way that the IT organization is perceived by the business. if every process today depends on IT to be successful, we need to have that seat at that strategic planning session when they're going out and saying, oh, we're going to go conquer this new market space, and we want to go build the new, biggest, greatest, better than Amazon website, right? So when the business is making those decisions, we have to be that trusted business partner where we can help them to understand where we can enable the business to successfully engage in new strategies and where we may not be well suited to help them to achieve those initiatives that they have. So we struggle with being able to understand what the business needs, prioritizing what we're doing in IT to meet the needs of the business, really getting that ability to sit down and negotiate and have those discussions with the business. This tends to be one of the biggest things that we are challenged with within IT is really becoming that partner with the business. So when we think about business IT integration, I thought this was interesting. This is actually a Gartner report that came out a couple of years ago, but they were predicting what was going to happen this year. It says fewer than 1% of service providers currently have service dependency mapping. And I'm going to show you a picture of what I mean by this mapping. This is kind of important. What we're doing is saying, okay, what is the business process, and how does that relate to the IT services that we're providing? That mapping is really where we can show and be able to align what we do with what the business needs. And they were predicting that by 2012, 5% of organizations would begin to incorporate this dependency mapping views at the point of contact where the customer is calling in at the service desk. So when you think about being able to understand how to integrate IT into the business, if we don't have a better understanding of what's occurring within the business and how these services that we create support the business objectives, it's very difficult to really have that business IT alignment. And here's that picture that I'm talking about. Notice at the very top, we see the different business units. I mean, that could be HR, finance, payroll, research and development, whatever the business unit is. They have these core business processes that they're doing. So within finance, maybe they're managing the IT finances of the business. So they're doing budgeting and accounting. If it's in payroll, right, their major business processes are paying, employees and doing paychecks and providing benefits information. So we have these core business processes. As a service provider, we need to understand what service does that business unit use to do those core business processes. And, by the way, we need to understand what depending services do we have in the environment that support that. So, for example, if it's email, which supports the process of global communications, we know that the email service it's the client, right? It's Outlook, it's the server, it's Exchange. It's also the database where we keep the PST files, and it's this server and this router and this, physical database. We need to understand, because if I'm about ready to bring down this router, I need to understand what business processes right now are connected to this piece of hardware so that I can truly understand the impact of what I'm about ready to do on the business. So this is when we think about a service catalog, when we think about a service portfolio, we really need to enable us to understand where the business process is depending on the services. This is where we get a really good view of how we integrate with the business processes. So it becomes a very important part of understanding the complete IT service. It's what the business uses. They think of it as Outlook, right, because they're clicking on an icon on their desktop that says Outlook, but our view is so much more than that. It's Outlook plus Exchange plus all of these IT components. That provides a tremendous amount of visibility into how to better manage those services. So within the 2011 release of the ITIL framework, we now have this a little bit different picture of the service catalog where we have the business view that connects the business process with the service that the customer perceives as the service. And then, of course, we have the technical view where we have it mapped to all those supporting services like networking, authentication, data warehousing, and then, of course, all of the kind of enhancing services that might distinguish, an offering, gold, silver, bronze type like packaging. So what is governance? I mean, we see that we're facing all of these challenges, but what is governance's role in enabling us as an organization to better manage these challenges? IT governance is defined as a set of relationships and processes that we put in the service provider realm that enable us to direct and control what we're doing to enable the enterprise to meet its goals and objectives, providing that value, and then balancing the risk versus the return of investment over what we're providing to the business. And when we think about governance, this is something that comes out of the ITIL framework. But when we typically in an IT organization, when we begin thinking about governance, we think about having this governance group, this kind of a steering committee that enables us to connect with the business to understand what their strategies and plans are, and then connects those plans to the IT goals and plans and things that we're doing, and then those then are articulated through to the functional units where they're creating their goals and objectives, and then that dictates what we're doing at the IT activity level. And so what we're trying to do is create this connectedness, to really have that seat at the corporate strategy level, and then make certain that we understand and align what we're doing in IT to support that strategy. So today what we typically do is, I'm a server guru. I focus in on that server, and I get kind of the blinders on, and I really only think about what that server does, and I want the best possible server that I could ever probably provide. What it forces us to do is step back and say, okay, but you know what? The business has got this new strategy, and this server doesn't do anything right now to deliver value towards what the business is focused on today. So what it's forcing us to do is say, okay, well, what is the business doing, and what in IT should we be focusing on? Maybe it's something completely different. Improving our event monitoring across the board is better going to provide value to the business. So what we have to do is draw visibility, and it starts with understanding what is the business doing and how can we align what we're focused in on IT to support what the business is doing. It's broken down into these two primary ideas of direct and control. And the greatest example I can give you of this is like a thermostat. When you set the temperature in a room, the thermostat is meant to understand, okay, 72 degrees is the direction. Ooh, it's too hot in the room. Let's turn on the air conditioner and bring it back to 72. Or it's too cold. Let's turn on the heating element so that we can bring it back up to 72. So if the business says, this is our goal, our direction of what we want, we have to put things in place that enable us to understand, okay, here's what we need to do to articulate what that strategy is, and now we need to be performing this particular set of activities. Now, how do we know that we're doing what we need to do? Then we have this whole control side where we're measuring what are we doing at the activity level. We feed that up to the goals and objectives level, and then we feed that back up to senior executives where they can see, oh, look, we're kind of tracking towards that strategy, but we need to make some changes in order to make certain that we are aligning what we're doing with what the business needs. So if we don't get that seat at the table, we never hear the direction, and we don't do a good job of articulating and making certain that we're doing the appropriate activities. The whole control side is where governance can help us. It can help us to define what we should be measuring in order to demonstrate back up to the business that we're successfully engaged in doing the right things within the organization to drive towards those strategic goals. Another primary concept of governance is defining responsibility. When you think about what can fail in an organization, it's when we don't define clear responsibility throughout the organization of what everyone should be doing as it relates to the strategic goals of the organization. So if, again, going back to my example of being a server guru, if I'm focused in on doing these particular activities around the server and I'm ignoring that the business needs me to be doing something else, then I'm not taking responsibility for my part in ensuring that we're meeting the business goals and objectives. So we need to clearly define what everyone's role is in order to successfully engage in that strategy. Along with that comes clear accountability. This is the buck stops here. It's no longer, it wasn't my fault. I love to hear that from my kids. It wasn't my fault. I didn't do it, right? We have to stop that and say, okay, someone needs to take accountability and say, you know what? It's my accountability here. I need to ensure that we're successfully creating the outcomes that we need to create to enable the business. So governance not only defines responsibility, it creates clear paths of accountability in the organization so that we can successfully say, okay, you're accountable for this, make it happen. And if it's not happening, you need to be accountable for making certain that you change whatever needs to happen in the environment to ensure that we are engaged on that strategy. Now, once we have clear responsibility and accountability, then we can clearly define the activities that we should be doing within the IT organization that will enable us to meet those IT goals, that will enable the business to meet their goals. So, when we think about that thermostat, there's a lot of things that have to happen to make certain that that temperature stays at that 72 degrees. The strategy of the organization, they set the direction, 72 degrees, but then there's the activities of things that have to happen in order to make that happen. So we have responsibility, we have direction, we have a clear accountability, and then we have very clearly defined activities of the organization. So the five focus areas within governance that enable the organization to really support the business and what they do are broken down here by strategic alignment, making certain that we're aligning what we do within IT with what the business needs, focused in on value delivery, making certain that what we're delivering enables the business process and does it in a way that creates value. We have to manage our resources, making certain that they're working on the right activities, that we have that clear accountability in the environment, and managing those resources to ensure that we're delivering the strategy of the business. We also need to focus on managing that risk, because if we don't, these are the things that can upset the balance in the environment of delivering value and aligning what we do with the business needs. And the last one is to have clear performance measurement in the environment that shows that not only are we measuring the right things, but we are, as an organization, moving ourselves in alignment with the business and always constantly staying, in alignment with what the business needs us to do. So let's talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. When we think about governance, right, one of the things that we need to do is to have clear strategic alignment. Enable us as that IT organization to become that partner, making certain that our plans interface with and directly link and connect with the business plans. And that when the business changes, we are focusing what we're doing in order to define our value proposition to meet what those business needs are. Now, it's as much about connecting and linking as it is about then articulating those goals and objectives throughout the organization, making certain that what we're doing ties to the business objectives. Value delivery is about better being able to understand business requirements, design services that meet those business requirements, while at the same time optimizing our costs and making certain that we can deliver that value to the business. So governance enables us to do this. It helps us to better align and better understand what those requirements are and deliver on that promise. Resource management goes hand in hand with this. Managing our data, our information, managing the applications, the infrastructure, and our people in a way that enables us to deliver on the value proposition. We have to have the right core capabilities matched to what the business needs us to do, manage those resources, and making certain that we are paying attention to the future needs of the business so that as the business changes, we're aligning our appropriate resources and capabilities to meet the needs of the business. Performance measurement, remember I talked about the control aspect, is all about we have to understand the strategy, we have to understand how that is being driven to the IT level and our activity level, and then go and look at what can we measure at the activity level that can then match back up to the business goals and objectives so that we can show clear accountability of what we're focused on and how that is meeting the needs of the organization. If we can't measure at that activity level, it becomes very difficult for us to then communicate up to the business level actually what we're doing to meet business objectives. And the last part of this is to have formal risk management in place so that we can manage the risks that I was talking about earlier. The risk associated with, supplier contracts, operational risks. There's so many risks that we have within the IT organization because of the complexity of the environment, the integral nature in which the business processes depend upon the IT services. So when we talk about managing risk, we need to come up with ways to mitigate that risk, either get rid of it completely or minimize it. We can transfer that risk. We can outsource something that maybe we don't do as well as we probably could to someone that's their core capability and they know how to manage that risk for us. Another part of it is understanding what is the business's appetite for risk. So you and I both know that a government agency is very risk adverse. They don't want to take risk as it relates to the public good. But if we're a fresh start company that's very entrepreneurial in nature, we're probably going to be taking a lot more risk, and that's acceptable to the business because we want to innovate and be on the cutting edge, right? So if we understand what's the level of risk that's acceptable to the business, we can then manage any risk that's unacceptable, right? So we have to understand the palette. And then, of course, we can change our strategy to just avoid a particular risk that we might see in the environment. So this requires us to have much greater awareness and understanding of the corporation as well as what we're doing within IT to help manage that risk within the environment. So let's talk a little bit more about the role of risk management in enabling the organization to successfully fulfill the governance role. This is a picture of the kind of the high-level description of what risk management is. We have these core assets, whether they're in the business or in IT. And those assets are part of delivering the services. They're part of delivering the core business mission. When we look at those assets, we have to say, okay, what are the threats? What are the things internally that could be a threat to those assets in the organization? And then we look at what are the vulnerabilities. These are things externally that could impact our ability to manage those assets. When we look at those two areas, threats and vulnerabilities, we come up with a set of risks. Those risks have to then be prioritized by the likelihood that they're going to happen and the impact that they're going to have on the environment. Any risk that has a high impact or likelihood, we need to then go and look at what can we do, to put countermeasures in place that will help us to do the four things that we were just talking about: mitigate, avoid, transfer, etc. Then we implement those countermeasures, measure the success of those countermeasures, and then we go back up and say, okay, what are our assets? What are the remaining threats and vulnerabilities? And again, prioritize those. So this is an ongoing mechanism for us to identify, analyze, and manage risks within the environment. Now here's a kind of a high-level risk management framework. We still have both sides, the analysis and the management, but we're doing things from a high-level perspective of identifying the risk, identifying owners that will manage those risks, understand what's the acceptable level of tolerance of risk at the business level, and then, of course, those responses to managing that risk or implementing, measuring the effectiveness, and then embedding a review cycle into this. So this is kind of the high-level governance framework where the day-to-day activities around risk management are built into that from an organizational perspective. Now, when we look at kind of how do we assess risk, if we see this picture in front of us, right, we all know that there's power failures, there could be corruption in a database, somebody could spill coffee, maybe there's a major network outage, storm damage, fire. When we begin brainstorming what are the potential risks, we see that some of them are very unlikely to happen, and the severity of the damage that it could create is very low. And so that becomes our palatable amount of risk, right? Anything below that line going across there is an acceptable level of risk. But what's unacceptable is everything above that. Chemical leaks, store damage, theft, server failure. And so anything above that level of acceptable risk, especially anything that's going into the most likely, most severe to happen, we need to have countermeasures in place. So for fire, we have fire extinguishers, we have sprinkler systems. That helps to minimize if a fire were to happen, minimizing the risk that could cause such substantial damage within the environment. So this is the exercise of saying, okay, what are our assets and what are the risks? What's acceptable, what's unacceptable, and what's the most likely and most damaging to occur within the environment. Now, when we think about service design risks, right, what are the things that could impact us from a design perspective? Now, I've been down this path many, many times where we're designing services for the business. If those services don't have very clearly defined business requirements, it's probably unlikely that when we get to the point where it's implemented in the environment, it's going to deliver what the business needs because we didn't understand what the business needs, what they needed. Or we start down the path of designing, and all of a sudden the business comes back and says, oh, wait, our requirements are changing. We've started and initiated this project, and at some point we have to say, okay, no mas. We can't go in and change any more requirements. It's going to impact our ability to actually engage successfully on delivering this new service. If we don't manage the budget or our resources effectively, poor communication, we have poor maturity of processes, then I guarantee you we will have risk within service design. So we need to better manage this, and organizations go after doing things like developing a project management group, so we do better at managing the risk related to the projects. We develop formal communication plans, right? There are ways for us to be able to minimize and mitigate the risks around service design. Now, when we think about continuity risks, there are many times where, and we've seen this in recent history, where there have just been disasters on scales that we never even conceptually thought was possible. So when we begin looking at the risks to the organization, we have to hypothetically think, what are the things that could happen from a disaster perspective that could impact the continuity of services? And the business has their planning. So if I'm in healthcare, right, if there's a major storm or some sort of a major catastrophe, the hospital is going to have its continuity plans of how it will handle patient care. We have to think about, all right, well, you also depend on these IT services. How critical are they in the continuity of providing health care? And so we're aligning what we need to do to enable the business to meet its objectives during those times of disaster. So it's about creating the relationships, defining what the business needs, and then creating a strategy within IT that will enable us to meet the business needs and deliver on those expectations in the time that continuity is required. Security brings a whole new level of complexity. We have physical security, right? What do we do about ensuring that the server's behind, locked doors and that it's got environmental security risk managed, like power backups, only allowing certain people access to the secure environment. Then there's the whole logical security, people hacking into systems, and so we have this business security policies about managing employee security around computer use, internet use, policies for passwords. We have this whole element of policy that comes into play, as well as the physical and logical security in the environment. So we think about, we have to, as a service provider, manage that risk, develop those policies, educate not just the business, but all of our IT employees as well, so that our risk management around security enables the business to meet its needs around security for all of its data. So again, we're matching what we're doing within IT to meet the needs of the business. Now, when we transition services into the environment, we also have an amount of risk that has to be managed. We have this live environment where we're doing a really good job of maintaining and keeping the services up and operational, and along comes this brand new service, and it is implemented in the environment, and all havoc breaks out, right? So what we have to do is we have to know that any time we make a significant modification to an existing service or bring a new service on board, that there is risk around the transition of that service into the environment. We have to be able to manage our resources, our costs, the schedules of everything that are going on in the business and in the live environment today, and be able to plan effectively so that when we implement that, we're not unduly impacting that schedule. So if the business has got this, major initiative, we're going to go out and go conquer the EMEAs in January, we wouldn't want to have this major new upgrade come in January. We want to be able to manage the risk associated with the schedule of when things happen with what the business is doing as well as IT. So these risks are around cost, sharing knowledge, the integration between processes, lack of maturity and communication can impact transition risks, as well as, the productivity within the environment. So we, as an organization, go after governance to help us manage risk around transition. Then when we think about the operational risks, this is the day-to-day things that are going on. We don't want to make the silly mistakes that will end up impacting hugely on the business. So there's, things like power failures, projects that we're doing that may not necessarily be major projects that will get transitioned, but the smaller improvement projects that we're doing that don't necessarily have a significant visibility, we have to make certain that we're not doing stupid things that impact those services. Paying attention to the fact that it is that value network, and if we do pull on the side of the spider web, we have a good chance of disrupting and creating, havoc within the entire network. So we need better visibility on all the projects that are occurring within the operational environment and how those impact the current services that we're delivering. There's environmental risks of, letting someone walk in behind you without a badge, or, the backhoe going out and digging up a whole bunch of cabling. There's all types of things that can impact the operational environment that we also need to control and manage. Third-party vendors, the way that we manage those relationships on an ongoing basis in the delivery of services, that needs to be well managed so that we can ensure successful delivery of services. Security, new services, new customers, all of this represents risk to the live operational environment that we use governance to help us to manage so we can successfully continue to deliver those services in the live environment. So governance is the ability as an organization to deliver better quality services that meet the needs of the business. It creates greater transparency between what the business needs and what we're delivering. It creates confidence from the senior management within the business that we can deliver what they want and engage with the business in defining and delivering on their needs. It ensures a higher return on investment, and it's about managing, mitigating, transferring, or accepting a level of risk within the environment. Now, and I'll just add this as a side note, if you're interested in looking at what can deliver greater governance within the environment, I highly recommend that you go and look at COBIT. COBIT stands for Control Objects for Information and Related Technology, and it is the framework that's out there that helps to put the controls in place. It helps us to get to that strategic advisory level. It helps us define roles and responsibilities, create clear accountability. And it is produced by ISACA, I-S-A-C-A, ISACA.org. And you can go out there and download the most recent version of the COBIT framework for free if you create a username and password. And it's a framework that is designed from the bottom up to be that governance framework. When you identify a weakness using something like COBIT, then you're going to come and look at ITIL as a way to address the weaknesses that you have in your environment. So governance is the ability for us to do the things that we're talking about here on this slide. ITIL is not necessarily a governance framework. It's more of a service management framework. COBIT would be something that would enable us to do governance within our environment. So how can I help you to better understand this? First of all, I'm going to go over here and begin looking at the questions that you have submitted, and hopefully while we're answering the ones that I have up here, I'll be able to, you can submit some new ones. I don't know about the audio. Hopefully I was able to correct that. We've got some questions that have come in through email. Let's see. How do you convert external drivers like cost to internal desires? I'm going to go back and look at something like COBIT. COBIT actually has a mechanism for saying, okay, what is the current business driver? And it maps those business goals and objectives to IT goals and objectives, maps those to then IT processes, and within those IT processes, you have these activities that are defined. So I kind of like to call it like the secret sauce on a Big Mac. You don't really know what's in there, but it just makes the Big Mac taste better. So they've spent a significant amount of time to create those connectors so that you can understand what's going on in the business and what we're doing internally, and mapping what we're focused on within the IT organization to what the business needs. So I highly recommend that you look at something like COBIT as a way to address that type of connecting what we're doing externally to what we externally within the business to what we do internally within IT. Next question here is, where do you start with process or dependency mapping? And that's a good question. I'm actually working with an organization today where we're beginning the process of mapping those dependencies. I think the easiest place to start, I use that word loosely, what are we doing today? Going and looking at what are the services that we're providing in the IT organization today, and who is our customer. I think if we can begin by mapping that business-facing view of those services, then we immediately can begin understanding what's our value proposition and begin better managing those services that the business is depending on. Now, as soon as we begin looking within the IT realm and we look at all the supporting services, we get really complex very quickly. So, go out, begin discovering what's in the live environment, connecting it to our customers. It's an Excel spreadsheet with a lot of data that just requires us to sit down, review, and go through. It's a very tedious exercise. But if we can define what we're doing in the live environment, then we can get control over the beginning of that, which is, what we do today. Connecting that to some sort of a project management, portfolio management would be the next step that would enable us to say, okay, now we see that we have these services coming in. We need to capture the data that we need about those today as we're building them before they go into the live environment. So we're no longer going back and having to go out and rediscover. We have that pipeline attached so that we can capture the relevant information that's necessary as those services come on board. It's not easy. There's no doubt that understanding how our services connect to our customers is a very difficult thing to do, but it's data intensive more than anything else. It's getting concurrence across a broader audience. So that's kind of where I would recommend starting with. Next question is, how does ITIL v3 add to IT governance? Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you is we no longer call it ITIL v3. With the 2011 edition of the books, they kind of said, let's get rid of all this versioning. So we're just now calling it ITIL. ITIL maps to governance. I kind of like to look at it this way. If I identify that change management is a weakness within my governance framework, I then go to ITIL to figure out how can I do change management better. Right? It's kind of giving me more of the practical advice of what change management should look like in the environment. The governance is going to identify the weaknesses. So COBIT or something like ISO 20000 would help me to identify those weaknesses. ITIL would help me to address and improve them. So that's kind of the way that the two things fit together. My next question is, where do you start in the IT governance assessment? That's actually an excellent question and something that I don't mention in this presentation. If you just go to ISACA's website, again, www.isaca.org, ISACA.org, I think that's how you spell it, COBIT has these maturity assessments built into the framework. So, for example, if the business is focused in on a goal like improving their customer orientation, they want to have much better customer service. In COBIT, you can see that that business goal is mapped to an IT goal of providing better customer service, which is mapped to incident management, problem management, availability management, right? If you see that that's what you should be focusing on because the business wants us to have better customer service, the three processes, incident, problem, and availability, are where we should be focusing our efforts. Immediately we're left with, okay, well, how well are we doing incident, problem, and availability today? And they have process maturity guidelines there that can tell you, oh, we're at a level 1 or a level 2, and we can determine, hey, we want to be at a level 3. So how do we get there? Then we can go over to ITIL and find out, you know, what are we missing in our implementation of a particular process that would enable that process to do a better job of meeting the needs of the business. So that connection between what the business is focused on and where we need to focus internally within IT comes from looking at what is the business focused on and how does that align with what IT is doing. And so COBIT is very helpful in focusing in on what we should be doing and then giving us the tools to assess the current level of maturity. Next question here is, where does this all start at the manager, director, VP level, or somewhere else? Interesting. Governance can start anywhere. But I can tell you that effective governance is always going to start at senior management, right? If you go back to that picture where we showed the governance realm working with, you know, all the different levels within IT, it's very hard to get governance across the organization without the board of directors and the C-level being involved. Now, often the drivers that are forcing the business to begin looking at governance are coming externally from these laws or regulations like HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley. But very quickly they realize to enable the business to meet those laws and regulations, they have to engage IT. But even if that's not a driver within your organization, that doesn't mean that IT can't begin to see that to enable us to deliver greater value, we have to have more effective governance. So governance is control. And so measuring and using that information to improve what we're doing to align with the business can begin anywhere. So I would like to say that does it start in a particular place? Probably not. You'll have different levels of governance going on today, even though you don't call it governance. But clearly, you're not going to get effective governance across the board if it's not being driven from the board of directors or the C-level of the organization. All right, I have one more question here, and we have about 5 minutes left. Does COBIT fit in the ITIL, ITSM governance picture? Oh, how does it? I think we kind of addressed that, but I like to think about COBIT as the how-to, or what should I be focused on. It's kind of the map that lets us, identify what in IT we should be looking at to better support the business. It has a much more expansive view than ITIL does. For example, it brings in project management and assesses the maturity of the project management office within an organization. It brings into perspective the strategy of the organization and how effective is the strategy being set and communicated. So we have a broader view of what we know delivers on that IT governance. Now, there are certain areas within COBIT that we know are tied to ITIL. So, for example, if I realize that change management isn't being very effective, I'll go to ITIL to help me with that. But if I recognize that project management is immature and not as successful, then I'm going to go to PMBOK to help me with that. So because it has a broader view across a larger kind of picture of what drives governance, there may be the need to bring an ITIL or PMBOK or an ISO standard or, some other methodology into the picture to enable governance across the organization. So COBIT is much more connected between IT and the business. It kind of sits right there between IT and the business, mapping the two together, whereas ITIL is much more IT focused and focused on IT outcomes. So it fits together quite nicely, but many organizations go after ITIL and then quickly realize that we can improve processes, until we're blue in the face. But until we make certain that we're focused on the right processes that are enabling what the business needs us to do, we could be spinning our wheels and spending a lot of time and money in places that aren't really creating value for the business at any given time. So COBIT to me is, what should I be doing? ITIL is, okay, now that I know what I'm supposed to be focused on, how do I do it? Well, that wraps up all the questions that I have, and I see from looking at the slide deck that we have about 2 minutes left on my time clock for the completion of this. Let me just give you my connectivity. Wow, where did that come from? Let me give you my contact information, and feel free to connect with me on Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever. That's all available to you here. But send me an email, jlmoore@mindtheitgap.com, if you have any other additional questions about governance. I also have a course around governance. If you're interested in learning more information about this or the COBIT framework, I would be more than willing to connect you so that you can get more in-depth information on the topic of governance. That's all I have for you today. Again, I just want to thank everybody for coming and attending. This is a great topic, and I think it needs a lot more visibility. ITIL tends to steal the show, and a lot of organizations are kind of missing, how can I connect what I'm doing to the business, and that's where governance really plays a part.